The Black Sabbath lead singer Ozzy Osbourne has died at the age of 76.
Have you ever watched a legend fade, not in fire but in silence? Ozzy Osbourne, the man who turned pain into power, madness into music, and chaos into a career, was never supposed to go quietly. For decades, he was the voice that rattled arenas, the storm that tore through stages, and the soul who refused to be tamed. But in the end, there were no spotlights, no crowds, no encore. There was only a quiet countryside home, and a family holding on as long as they could. In his final days, the Prince of Darkness did something no one expected. With his body failing and time running out, he made one last impossible request, a farewell performance that would defy doctors, expectations, and even death itself. This is the story of how Ozzy Osbourne, frail, broken, and facing the end, gave the world one final show that shook the heavens, and then left quietly, with nothing but love surrounding him. Because legends don't vanish, they echo. For years, Ozzy Osbourne seemed untouchable, surviving addiction, near-death experiences, and decades of touring that would have broken a lesser man. But in 2020, the unthinkable happened. Ozzy revealed that he had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, a cruel and relentless condition that slowly robs the body of control. At first, fans thought the Prince of Darkness would fight it the way he had fought everything else, with grit, humor, and music. And for a while he did. He joked about his tremors, called himself a medical miracle, and even talked about getting back on stage. But behind the public smiles, the disease was already winning battles. Simple tasks became exhausting. Standing for more than a few minutes left him winded. The man who once leapt across stages was now struggling just to walk across a room. And it wasn't just the physical toll. For Ozzy, who had always lived loudly, the silence was devastating. Yet even as his body weakened, he refused to let the illness define him. "I'm still here," he would say with a crooked grin, his eyes still full of fire. But the truth was hard to ignore. Life as he knew it had changed forever, and that was only the beginning of a fight that would test every ounce of strength he had left. While the world watched Ozzy Osbourne's decline from a distance, one person saw it all up close: his wife, Sharon, the woman who had managed his career, weathered his darkest moments, and stood by him through chaos and controversy, now faced her most painful role yet, watching the love of her life fade.
I just thought he was the funniest, sweetest guy I'd ever met, because he was so vulnerable about everything. And that just attracted me to him.
She never flinched. From morning tea to late-night tremors, Sharon was there, every hour, every breath. She kept his routine steady, made his medications manageable, and learned how to read his smallest gestures when words became too hard. And yet, through it all, she didn't just serve as a caregiver. She was his anchor, his protector, his voice when his own began to fail. In the quiet moments, she'd replay old interviews and concert footage beside him. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they cried, but most of the time they just sat hand in hand, saying everything without speaking a word. It wasn't about caretaking, it was about connection. And it was Sharon who held on to the version of Ozzy the world almost forgot. Not the man in a hospital bed, but the firestorm who once ruled rock and roll. And when he whispered his final, most impossible wish, she didn't hesitate for a second. As Ozzy's body began to break down, his mind remained razor sharp, a cruel twist in a disease that often robs people of both. He might have struggled to lift a cup or form a sentence, but behind those tired eyes was the same man who once commanded stadiums with a scream. He remembered everything. Stories from the road, song lyrics from decades ago, inside jokes with Sharon and the kids. Even when speaking became a struggle, he'd offer a crooked grin, a knowing blink, or a quiet chuckle when someone hit a familiar note. And that spark, that unmistakable Ozzy spark, still flickered behind his gaze. Kelly would sit by his side, sharing wild tales from their family's past, and he'd give a soft nod or a twitch of the mouth, just enough to show he was still there. Jack played old Black Sabbath riffs on his phone, watching for that half-smile of approval. Amy brought books and just sat quietly beside him, knowing her presence spoke louder than words ever could. Ozzy wasn't gone, not yet. He was just trapped inside a body that no longer obeyed. But the man, the father, the husband, the storm, was still very much alive. And when the silence grew too loud, he found one final way to remind them all who he truly was. It happened late one evening, as golden light spilled through the curtains of their countryside home. Ozzy, frail but alert, turned to Sharon and whispered something so unexpected it stopped her breath. "I don't want to be remembered in a wheelchair. I want to sing one last time, in Birmingham." That single sentence changed everything. For Ozzy, Birmingham wasn't just a city. It was where it all began. The muddy streets, the working-class grit, the birthplace of Black Sabbath, the cradle of his legend. And now, he wanted to end where he had started. Not as a fading icon, but as a performer. Just one more time. Sharon knew instantly what he was asking. This wasn't about ego or legacy. It was about dignity, about reclaiming the stage before he lost the strength to stand. Doctors had warned them of the risks. Ozzy's condition was fragile, unpredictable. A show could kill him, but Sharon didn't argue. She just nodded. Because deep down, she knew something the rest of the world didn't. Ozzy wasn't asking to be remembered. He was asking to feel alive one last time. And from that moment on, everything, every breath, every plan, every heartbeat was about making that impossible wish come true. Sharon didn't wait. As soon as Ozzy made his request, she quietly began to move mountains. First came the venue, Villa Park in Birmingham. It had to be there. Then came the calls, doctors, bandmates, managers, production crews. She wasn't asking for opinions. She was assembling an army. Behind closed doors, she began crafting something no one thought possible. A final concert for a man who could barely stand. The risks were staggering. Ozzy would need a full medical team on standby. Every step, from transportation to lighting to temperature control, had to be meticulously planned. Even the stage was redesigned with accessibility in mind. No stairs, no pyrotechnics, no sudden cues. Everything built around one goal, keeping him safe while letting him shine. She told no one, not even the children. This wasn't a press event. It wasn't about headlines or spectacle. It was sacred. Because Sharon knew that if the world found out too soon, it would become a circus. And Ozzy didn't want to be pitied. He wanted to perform. It was a logistical nightmare. But Sharon didn't waver. She took every ounce of fear, every whispered doubt from doctors, and buried it beneath a single vow. He will go out the way he lived, loud, proud, and unforgettable. And as the plans took shape, something began to stir in the man who had nearly given up. In the quiet corners of their home, something incredible began to happen. As preparations for the concert moved forward, Ozzy, who had once struggled to sit upright, started to come alive again. It began with the music. Amy brought in a small band to rehearse softly in the living room. The volume was low, the energy gentle, but as the first notes rang out, Ozzy's eyes flickered open, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. Not a showman's grin, but something deeper. The music, the rhythm, it reached a part of him untouched by pain or Parkinson's. Kelly sat beside him, coaching him through vocal warm-ups. She knew he couldn't hit the high notes anymore, but that wasn't the point. It was about connection, about breath, about remembering who he was. Jack, ever the quiet backbone of the family, handled the logistics, security, transport, medical backup. He ensured every detail was covered, every risk minimized. If the show was going to happen, it had to be airtight. And Sharon? She watched all of it unfold with a quiet kind of awe. The man who had once lost his will to move was now humming under his breath, tapping his fingers to an old Sabbath groove, asking for another round of tea, and to hear that one riff again. Ozzy wasn't just preparing for a show, he was becoming Ozzy again. But even as the fire reignited, the disease had no intention of letting go without a fight. As rehearsals continued, so did the reminders that time was running out. Some days, Ozzy couldn't lift his arms. Other days, the tremors were so violent he couldn't hold a cup. There were nights when Sharon had to help him in and out of bed just to adjust his position. His body so riddled with pain, it felt like even gravity had turned against him. And yet, he never said stop. Even on the hardest days, he'd whisper, "One more show." It wasn't a request anymore. It was a mission, a plea, a vow. Behind closed doors, Sharon wept. She knew this concert might be the final push that took him over the edge. Every doctor had warned her, he may not survive this. But she also knew something else. Without it, he wouldn't truly be living. So she pressed on, quietly managing his care while fueling his dream. The family followed her lead. No one talked about the risks. They talked about the set list, the lighting, the seat placement. They talked about hope. This wasn't about making him strong again. That ship had sailed. This was about honoring the man who had given everything, for music, for fans, for family, and was now asking for the only thing he'd never truly gotten, a goodbye on his own terms. And when July arrived, so did the storm. July 5th, 2025. Villa Park in Birmingham was packed with over 40,000 fans. But this wasn't a typical rock concert. There was no roar of anticipation, just a heavy, reverent silence. People didn't come for a show. They came for a farewell. As the lights dimmed and the opening notes of Mama, I'm Coming Home echoed through the air, the crowd erupted, not in screams, but in tears. This was the song Ozzy chose to open with, a song not about rebellion or rage, but about love, about return, about endings. Then, beneath a single spotlight, he appeared. He wasn't standing. He didn't need to. Seated in a custom-built black throne, crafted like a Gothic crown, Ozzy was wheeled to center stage. His body was trembling, his hands were weak, but his presence was unshakable. He gripped the microphone. The first lyric cracked from his throat like a whisper, dragged through decades of wear. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was real. So real that even the most hardened fans wept openly. And from the wings, Sharon watched, her hand over her heart, her eyes full of tears, because this wasn't a comeback. This wasn't about nostalgia. This was a man defying death for one more moment under the lights. And what unfolded next didn't feel like a concert. It felt like resurrection. As the show unfolded, it became clear this wasn't just a goodbye. It was something sacred. Every song carried the weight of a lifetime. No More Tears turned the audience into a sea of sobs. Iron Man sent chills down every spine in the arena. And behind Ozzy, a massive screen played memories. Grainy footage of Black Sabbath's early days, home videos of Sharon and the kids, behind-the-scenes moments no one had ever seen. Fans didn't just watch, they remembered. In between songs, a pre-recorded message played over the speakers. Ozzy's voice, fragile but firm, echoed across the stadium. Dying is a fact. I didn't want to disappear silently. I had to say goodbye in person. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Many had suspected this would be his last performance, but hearing it in his own voice, spoken like a confession from the edge of existence, made it real. Even the most skeptical fans stood frozen, their phones forgotten, their faces streaked with tears. This wasn't about the notes he hit or the ones he missed. It was about truth, about vulnerability, about facing the end with the same fire that made him immortal in the first place. And as the crowd stood in stunned silence, Ozzy gave them one more gift, a final anthem that would shake the sky. The lights dimmed once more. Then came the unmistakable opening riff of Crazy Train.
You know, we're laid up for like fucking 6 years. And it's so, you've got no idea how I feel. Man.
The crowd erupted, not in celebration, but in catharsis. Fans screamed. Some wept. Others simply stood with hands over their mouths, frozen by the weight of the moment. Ozzy gripped the microphone with trembling fingers. He didn't roar the words, he whispered them. All aboard, he croaked, and the response from 40,000 voices was deafening. He didn't sing every line. Sometimes he leaned back and let the crowd carry it for him. Other times he just closed his eyes and mouthed the words. But it didn't matter, because in that moment, Ozzy wasn't dying. He was alive, in the way only a true performer can be when they're wrapped in sound, sweat, and love. The final chord rang out, and a heavy stillness settled over the stadium. Ozzy stayed seated, gazing into the sea of faces that had followed him through every high and every crash. Then slowly, he raised one hand. A single farewell, silent, powerful, eternal. On the screen behind him, 2 words appeared. Thank you, Ozzy. Sharon walked onto the stage, not as a manager, but as his wife. She didn't say a word. She helped him to his feet, steadying his body one last time. Together, they bowed. No encore, no spectacle, just silence. A silence that thundered louder than any applause. The lights at Villa Park had long faded. The guitars had gone quiet. The stage was dismantled. But in Ozzy's countryside home, something deeper lingered. Stillness. Not the emptiness of death, but the stillness of peace. There were no crowds now, no monitors or medics, just family. Sharon never left his side. The same hands that once booked stadium tours now adjusted his pillows, held his tea, and wiped his brow. The kids returned to the rhythm of quiet love. Kelly stayed at the foot of his bed, her fiery spirit subdued, telling stories that made him smile. Jack watched from the window, his silence stronger than words. Amy knelt by his side, reading softly, letting music float through the halls. No one cried out loud. No one said goodbye. They simply stayed present because Ozzy was still here. His final performance hadn't drained him. It had completed him. He wasn't restless anymore. He was ready. And as the sun dipped low over the fields, Ozzy opened his eyes, locked gazes with Sharon, and whispered two simple words: "I'm ready." No fanfare, no spotlight, just breath, love, release. The man who had faced the world with thunder was now walking into silence. 17 days after Ozzy's final bow, the world exhaled in heartbreak. The news broke like a thunderclap, not just across headlines, but across hearts. The man who had once been called unkillable, unstoppable, immortal, was gone. But he didn't vanish quietly. His departure triggered a global mourning unlike anything seen in rock history. In Sao Paulo, fans poured into the streets with candles, chanting his name like a hymn. In Tokyo, massive digital billboards in Shibuya displayed his face as strangers paused mid-commute to watch, cry, and remember. In Times Square, a tribute video looped for hours. Traffic slowed. People stopped. Social media exploded. "Thank You, Ozzy" trended in more than 60 countries. Thousands posted old concert photos, stories of how his music had saved them, healed them, carried them. From teenagers in battle jackets to gray-haired bikers with tattoos from Sabbath tours, the grief was universal. Celebrities weighed in. Elton John called him a rebel poet. Paul McCartney said simply, "Legends echo." Even the Vatican released a rare statement. Though his methods were unconventional, his passion moved generations. But no voice carried more weight than Sharon's. And when she finally spoke, the world stopped to listen. Because if Ozzy was the storm, she had been the calm behind it for over 4 decades. When Sharon Osbourne finally stepped into the public eye after Ozzy's death, she wasn't the composed manager the world remembered. She was a widow, a woman holding the last thread of a love that had defied every storm. Under soft studio lights, she sat in silence for several seconds. A small gold wedding ring clutched tightly in her hand, the same one Ozzy had placed there decades earlier. Her voice trembled as she finally spoke. "He didn't just want to live forever," she whispered. "He wanted to matter forever, and he does." She paused, letting the weight of the words settle. Then, with tears welling in her eyes, she added, "He gave everything, even when there was nothing left to give." There was no spin, no PR gloss, just truth, raw, aching truth. Sharon didn't talk about the record sales or the awards. She talked about the man who made her laugh at 2 a.m., the man who brought her tea even when he was the one in pain, the man who faced his darkest demons and still chose love over and over again. She looked straight into the camera, her voice steady now. If you ever saw him on stage, you saw the fire, but at home, he was warmth. And in that one sentence, she gave the world what it needed most, a reminder that Ozzy Osbourne wasn't just a legend, he was a man, and that made his story even more unforgettable. Ozzy Osbourne's legacy wasn't measured in platinum records or sold-out stadiums. It was felt in the way the world responded after he was gone. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame released a full-length tribute chronicling his journey from Aston's backstreets to international immortality. Fans left flowers, leather jackets, guitar picks, and handwritten letters beneath the bronze statue erected just months before his death. School children painted murals of Ozzy's wildest stage moments, while choirs in the city square sang, "Mama, I'm coming home," beneath the open sky. Even the buses flashed messages like "Thank you, Ozzy" across their LED displays. In small towns across Ireland, Canada, and Eastern Europe, candlelight vigils bloomed without coordination, proof that Ozzy's reach had no borders. His voice had been a lifeline for misfits, rebels, survivors. And now, in death, it had become a symbol of endurance, of chaos turned into beauty. He had been more than a musician. He had become a mirror for anyone who ever felt broken but chose to keep going anyway. And in every quiet tribute, the world wasn't just mourning a legend. It was saying thank you to the man behind the madness. To the world, Ozzy Osbourne was the Prince of Darkness, a force of nature, a chaos machine in leather and eyeliner. But at home, he was just Dad, the man who flipped pancakes while singing off-key in the kitchen, the one who braided Kelly's hair with shaking hands, the one who made up bedtime stories filled with monsters, magic, and way too many swear words. He was the man who left voice notes for his grandkids, half jokes, half life advice, because he knew one day his voice would be all they had left. He tried to record lullabies during his final months, whispering the melodies he once belted from arena stages. His children never saw a rock god. They saw a father who fought his demons and came back every time. Kelly once said, "People think Dad lived for music, but he really lived for us. Music just carried him through." Those memories, the unfiltered, unscripted moments of joy and vulnerability, were his real masterpiece. Not the stage pyrotechnics, but the quiet rituals of love. The world knew the legend, but his family knew the man who curled up in armchairs with tea, who got misty watching old home videos, who once sang "You Are My Sunshine" in a raspy whisper that made everyone cry. And in the end, that's who mattered most. Not the storm, the soul inside it. Ozzy's last lyrics weren't written in a studio. They weren't shouted across a stage. They were whispered between sips of tea and quiet moments before sleep, in the gentle pressure of his hand wrapped in Sharon's. He didn't need to rhyme them. He lived them. They came in simple sentences. Be good to each other. Tell Amy I'm proud. Don't forget the fire. As Parkinson's took more of his voice, he found new ways to speak. A nod, a smirk, a single raised eyebrow when Sharon tried to scold him for another bad joke. His humor never left, nor did his love. In his final weeks, he dictated voice messages to be saved, not for the public, for the people who mattered. In one, he told Jack, "Don't run from the madness. It's part of the music." In another, he told Sharon, "I still hear the chords when you walk in the room." And then there was the forgotten ballad, a song he wrote in his 20s but never recorded. One night, he quietly whispered the lyrics from memory as Sharon sat beside him. She scribbled them down, tears falling with every line. Those weren't just words. They were his last verses, not meant for charts, meant for hearts. Even as Ozzy's body faded, something inside him kept glowing. He may have needed help to sit. He may have sung in whispers, but that fire, the one that lit stadiums on fire and drove him through every fall, never fully died. You could still see it in the way he reacted to music, in the way he smiled when Sharon walked into the room, in the way he squeezed his children's hands when they shared old tour memories. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when even he doubted whether he could keep going. But then he'd mutter something like, "I'm still here, you know," just loud enough to remind everyone the storm hadn't passed. It was just quieter now. The world saw a man in decline, but his family saw something else. A man still fighting to matter, even when the world was ready to move on. He didn't leave them with silence. He left them with meaning, with lessons, with laughter. Because Ozzy Osbourne wasn't defined by his decline. He was defined by what he did in spite of it. And even in his final chapter, he kept writing in fire. Ozzy Osbourne's final days weren't just a farewell. They were a revelation. In a world that often hides death behind curtains and clinical silence, Ozzy chose to meet the end head-on, with music still echoing in his lungs. He didn't fade into obscurity. He didn't vanish behind hospital walls. He stood, shaking, seated, but unafraid, before thousands of fans and said, "I'm still here." That act alone rewrote what it means to grow old in the spotlight. It wasn't about legacy. It was about truth, about facing the inevitable with the same grit that had carried him through overdoses, scandals, and collapse. He gave permission to his fans, to other artists, to everyone, to age out loud. He showed that dignity doesn't come from hiding weakness. It comes from owning it. Most celebrities retreat when the curtain begins to fall. But Ozzy, he built a final stage, lit it with love, and stood at its center, fragile, raw, defiant. And when it was over, he didn't need a Grammy or a headline. He had something far more powerful. A family that adored him, a world that remembered, and a story that ended exactly how he wanted it to. Not with silence, but with one last unforgettable song. At the heart of Ozzy Osbourne's final days wasn't music, it wasn't fame, it wasn't even the show, it was love. It was Sharon, who had weathered decades of storms, stood through addiction, betrayal, triumph, and ruin, and still chose to stay. She wasn't just his wife. She was his protector, his translator when he couldn't speak, his strength when he had none left. It was his children, Kelly, Jack, and Amy, who moved through the home like guardians. Each of them brought something different to his bedside: stories, music, silence, devotion. They didn't care about the man the world had crowned a rock god. They cared about the man who tucked them in, who danced in the kitchen, who whispered, "I love you," even when his voice cracked. They were his fortress. When Ozzy trembled, they steadied him. When he forgot lyrics, they sang them back to him. When he could no longer walk, they carried him, not physically, but emotionally, spiritually, with every ounce of loyalty they had. Their home became sacred ground, not because of what it contained, but because of what it represented: a lifetime of madness anchored in unconditional love. That's what held Ozzy together, not his music, not his legacy, but the quiet hands that never let him fall. And when the time finally came, they didn't let go. They walked him home. Ozzy Osbourne took his final breath in silence, but the echo he left behind may never fade. His body is gone, the voice is quiet, but legends like Ozzy don't vanish. They don't fade into the background. They become part of us, part of the stories we tell, the songs we replay, the pieces of ourselves that dare to live louder because he once did. He was chaos and calm, fire and fatherhood, a whirlwind on stage and a whisper at home. And in the end, it wasn't the platinum records that defined him. It wasn't the outrageous headlines or the decades of spectacle. It was the final chapter, the one written in soft glances, trembling hands, and the unwavering devotion of a family who never stopped believing in the man behind the myth. Ozzy didn't die a rock star. He died a husband, a father, a soul held tightly by the people who loved him, not because of his fame, but in spite of it. He once sang, "I'm just a dreamer. I dream my life away." Now the dream is over, but the music plays on. Drop a comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more forgotten Hollywood tales.